and welcome to Coronavirus Q&A. Got a question about the pandemic? Tonight we'll try to answer as many of your COVID-19 queries as possible. First up, the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. Dr. Sarah Jarvis is standing by to listen to all your health concerns. ITV News' Chris Choi on what you can and can't do right now. And a loose woman in lockdown, Denise Welsh talks guilt-free living. You can still send us your questions. Email us at coronavirus@itv.com. On Twitter and Instagram, use the hashtag coronavirusQA or join the conversation on our Facebook page. So all that to come, but first, here's what you need to know. We're starting our 5th week in lockdown. 16,509 people have now died in hospital. An RAF flight has left for Turkey tonight to collect a consignment of 400,000 protective gowns for frontline workers.
And we are, of course, continuing to pursue every possible option for PPE procurement.
Plus, the Chancellor's much talked about furlough scheme to pay wages while people can't work officially opened today. We're here to put your questions to those making the decisions about your health and your life during the pandemic. My first guest tonight is Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister, who I spoke to a little earlier. Nicola Sturgeon, let's start with a question from Andrew. He's asking, as a devolved government, why can it not be the case that Scotland makes its own choices to control the spread of the virus?
Well, we do make our own choices and our own decisions, but we're trying to do that within a UK framework for, I guess, obvious reasons. This virus doesn't respect boundaries and people move freely across the UK. So the more we can act in concert, the more effective we can be at controlling the virus. That said, we've taken slightly different decisions at different times. In Scotland, we decided to call a halt to mass gatherings slightly ahead of the rest of the UK. We announced the closure of schools a little bit earlier. And of course, when lockdown came across the UK, it came at the same time in all parts of the UK, but Scotland was slightly earlier in the infection curve. We've also taken a slightly tougher stance on closing businesses. We've advised construction in the non-essential sector to close. So where we think it's necessary, we will take our own decisions. We're also responsible for the decisions and actions to build up capacity in the National Health Service here. But just as I think there needs to be stronger global action to combat this virus, we need to make sure that we're coordinating activity as much as possible across the UK too.
Does that mean you could envisage breaking ranks with the UK government when it comes to easing the lockdown?
Well, I think breaking ranks, if I may say so, is quite pejorative language, acting in a way that I think is in the best interests of people in Scotland. So if the data and the evidence tells us that we're at a different stage in the outbreak of coronavirus, if it tells us that we have to do things differently or in a different timeline, then of course I would consider that. I've just run through the issues in which we did take a slightly different view of things earlier. So of course we have to consider that, but doing what is right to slow down this virus and protect the health service and save lives for all of us is the absolute drive and imperative.
OK, let's get a question on care homes now. This one comes in from Chris. What is the First Minister's message to those who lost relatives in care homes due to her government's, he writes, mistaken directive to only use PPE, protective equipment, on symptomatic residents?
Well, look, the question is, what's my message to people in care homes or people who have lost loved ones in care homes? My message to anybody who's lost a loved one in this virus outbreak is one of deep sympathy and regret. I mean, I stand at the podium behind me every day and update the country on the number of people who've died. And every day I do that, I remind myself that these are not statistics. These are human beings who are leaving behind grieving families. And we've always got to remember that. We know that this virus, unfortunately, is one where older people are more susceptible to getting seriously ill and unfortunately dying. We also know that it's a virus that spreads more quickly in institutional settings like care homes. So that's why we are taking very careful action to make sure the right guidance is in place for PPE, which we've done with expert input. Also making sure in Scotland we've given leadership to public health directors working with local health protection teams, our care inspectorate and local authorities to make sure infection prevention and control in care homes is everything people would expect it to be. We put guidance out at a very early stage saying, and this is a tough message for people in care homes, that residents should be isolated and not gathering together communally. So this is really difficult, and I think emotionally for all of us, the thought of people in care homes being so susceptible to this virus is a very difficult one, but it makes it all the more important that we do all of the right things, learning the right lessons along the way to try to limit that as far as possible.
Do you think that you turn on masks in care homes will ultimately cost lives?
No, I don't think that is an assumption that can be made. We are very clear about the responsibility to make sure that we have a good supply of PPE, that we're getting that to the front line as quickly as possible. We've changed all of our distribution systems to get supplies to the front line effectively and efficiently, but also to make sure that the right guidance is in place for what PPE should be used in what circumstances. And the guidance that is now in place, it's a Four Nations guidance put together with the help of experts, very much says that people working on the front line should feel that they can use masks and other PPE unless they judge that it is not necessary. So it's very much about respecting and trusting the professional judgment of those on the front line, because we have such an obligation to do everything we can to protect those who are doing so much to care for us.
Lorraine wants to know, why are we still accepting flights to the UK without passengers being quarantined?
Well, I'm not saying this to pass the buck. You asked me about devolved and reserved responsibilities earlier on. Border control is a matter for the UK government. I think that will be an issue that we need to make sure we keep under review as we go into the next phase of dealing with this virus. At an earlier stage, I certainly was given advice, and this was a question I asked regularly about checks on people coming into the country, and temperature checks are not always reliable in telling you whether somebody has got the virus or not. But of course, the advice for everybody right now is to socially distance, to stay at home, not to be mixing outside your own household group, and that is I was going to say advice, that's actually the set of rules that are in place now for people in the country and anybody coming into the country as well.
Would you like to see a change in policy from the UK government about people coming into this country and not being checked at airports?
Well, I think when we're talking about checks, I think we've got to make sure that checks that we're doing is not giving us false assurance, so that we're not checking somebody's temperature, finding it's okay, and then assuming that they are well, when in actual fact the virus may still be there but not showing up in that way. So it's really important that we continue to stress the rules that are in place for everybody about social distancing, isolation when you have symptoms, and not mixing outside your own household. But as we go into the next phase of dealing with this virus, we don't know exactly when that will be yet, but as we start to ease some restrictions, we still have to suppress this virus. And the way in which I think we will require to seek to do that as we lift some of the restrictions is through what is described as testing, tracing and isolating. And I think when you're in a scenario like that, you cannot ignore similar controls and a similar oversight of people coming into the country. So certainly I do think that the UK government will have to give ongoing consideration to border control and what happens at ports of entry.
Nicola Sturgeon, thank you very much. Thank you. Dr. Sarah Jarvis is here to answer your health concerns now. Good evening to you. We'll start with the ongoing should or shouldn't we be wearing face masks. Here's a question from Howard.
Would it be advisable for everybody to wear face masks, even though the powers that be keep telling us that there is no evidence that this would do any good?
Jarvis, have you changed your position on masks at all?
Overall, there is little or no evidence that wearing a mask reduces your risk of catching coronavirus. And if other people are at least 2 meters away from you, then no, it's not going to make much difference. However, if you can't socially distance, it may reduce the risk of passing it on to other people. So as a general idea, no, I haven't. For some people, we shouldn't be using PPE because it should be safe for the professionals. Cloth masks may slightly reduce your risk of passing it on, but they're not going to reduce your risk of catching it.
All right. Andrea has a question about whether there's a link between a high BMI, body mass index, and COVID.
I have a BMI of 46. Should people like me be classed as extremely vulnerable?
Is she?
It's difficult to know if it's your weight as such or other conditions that go with it that mean that many people with a higher BMI are at higher risk. The ideal BMI, the ratio of your height to your weight, is 18.5 to 25. 25 to 30 is overweight, over 30 is obese. So somebody with a BMI over 40 is categorised as being at risk, but not at the highest risk.
We've also had lots of questions this week about smoking. Here is one of them from Liz.
Can the virus be carried in exhaled cigarette smoke or e-cigarette vapour?
Can it?
Well, it's an interesting question. Nobody's 100% certain, but we think the risk is very, very small. And the reason for that is that the virus is usually carried in saliva and mucus, whereas actually what you're blowing out when you're vaping is water and propylene glycol, which is what's used to make the vape. And of course, with cigarettes, you're blowing out cigarette smoke. So the chances of that being passed on are very small. Smoking is certainly an antisocial habit, and I wouldn't want anyone doing it near me, but the risks of catching coronavirus from it are small.
OK, that's reassuring. A really important question now from Alan about hospitals.
I'm due to be admitted to hospital for a coronary bypass operation. And while every precaution has been taken by the NHS during this epidemic, is it safe to go into hospital for the operation?
What should Alan be doing, Sarah?
Safe is a relative word, and of course your hospital is going to be taking every precaution it can. Most routine procedures have been cancelled, urgent procedures are going ahead, and your team will only recommend a procedure where they believe that the risk to you of not having it are going to outweigh any risk to you from coronavirus.
A question now from Linda, and again, a question we've had from lots of people. She says, I am 78. I was part of the BCG programme against TB when I was very young. She says when she was 10 or 11. I think many of us can remember getting that jab. Is there any truth in reports that this may offer me some protection against COVID-19?
There is a theory that it may reduce your risk, and that seems to have come from the fact that in countries where there is a BCG vaccination programme, fewer people are dying from it. The problem is that we don't know whether it's actually the BCG or some other factor, a so-called confounding factor. It certainly won't do any harm, but the evidence for it is not very strong, basically because tuberculosis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis and coronavirus are completely different. And we know, for instance, that even an immunisation against one kind of virus is not going to offer protection against another. It's possible, not terribly likely.
OK, Dr. Sarah Jarvis, as ever, thank you very much. We're going to take a short break now, but Chris Choi is standing by with answers to your questions about parental leave, annual leave and much, much more. Plus, why Spanish children are to be allowed outside for the first time in weeks. And
I think the guilt-freeness of doing very little is something that I've thoroughly enjoyed.
What life in lockdown looks for this loose woman. Welcome back. Let's take you to Spain now, a country which has seen one of the world's highest death tolls and strictest lockdowns. Children without a garden haven't been outside since mid-March. When this all started, Spain declared a state of emergency. All UK travel to the country was banned, but now some lockdown restrictions are starting to be lifted. Diego Arrizabalaga de Arquea is a journalist living in the capital, Madrid. Diego, what's it been like not being able to let your children go outside of the home at all?
Well, actually, I'm pretty lucky because I'm not living downtown Madrid. I live in the suburbs, so I had a chance to have a backyard so they can, let's say, go out and play, kick the ball or throw some basketballs. But it's pretty good news that's going to happen probably from next Monday, the 27th. But not just because of the announcement, but because of what it means. It means that we're starting to imagine at least the remote possibility of a life without this confinement, this lockdown, and that we are starting to win this. It seems it's going to be the first match against the coronavirus. On the other hand, that raises another question, right? What happens with those youngsters from 13 to 18? Because, for instance, I have 3 sons, but one of them just turned 13 like about a week ago, and I can tell you that he's not very happy about it.
No, okay. A lot of questions from viewers here that they're asking us, but you might be able to help us. When will we be able to go on holiday in Spain again?
Well, that's going to be a big issue because tourism is the most important industry here in Spain. It is about 15% of our GDP, and there are 3 million people working in that industry out of a population of 46 million here in Spain. And we don't know, but there's a fact that at least 6 out of the 8 islands in the Canary Islands didn't have any contagions for the last week. But as I said, it is going to be a big issue because of those 3 million people working in that industry, and they are, waiters, or maids, or cooks that don't have the biggest salaries, neither the biggest savings, and they are not going to be able to recycle into something else pretty easily because, on the other hand, what will they do as the economy is in neutral right now?
Diego Arrizabalaga de Arquea, thank you very much for your thoughts and insight into what's happening in your country right now. Do appreciate it. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Time to catch up now with Chris Choi, who's been going through all your questions about what you can and can't do right now and how to get help. Chris, let's start with a question from Mariama, who's a single mum. She writes, I need to stay at home because my 6-year-old daughter's asthma puts her at high risk. My manager said I can take parental leave, but this will be without pay. They also said I don't qualify for the government's furlough scheme because I am a key worker. What can she do?
Well, we might be off and running with some good news for Maria Ma in that, yes, she could actually qualify for this government furlough scheme, officially launched today, pays 80% of your normal salary. People who are looking after a family member who is shielding, as in her case, are eligible. The problem is, of course, this is all new for employees and bosses. It may be that her boss doesn't realise, and therefore I think the most important thing to do urgently is have that conversation with the employer.
OK, speak to your boss. Christine wants your advice about a difficult but a practical issue that is concerning quite a few people at the moment. She says, I'm 71 and want to make a will in case anything happens to me, but I've been told this is not possible as solicitors can't see you face to face for identification during lockdown.
Well, look, Christine, it is possible. In fact, you don't need to see the solicitor. They can draft the will and send it to you. The slight snag is you need 2 witnesses physically present. There are all kinds of ingenious ways around this. Some people have been popping their will through cracks in their windows and people have been witnessing it that way. Others have invited neighbours to the end of their driveway and managed to have it witnessed using social distancing. The lawyers and the will writers are still in business and we'll give you some practical tips along those lines.
OK, a question here from John. He says, my employer is forcing everyone to take at least 2 weeks annual leave before the end of June. Can they do this?
Sorry, John. I think the boss in this case may be within their rights. There is a new guidance which allows you to take over 4 weeks of leave for up to 2 years, but the boss has to agree. In this case, it doesn't look like that's happening, and therefore I don't think that John's going to get his way. And in the boss's defence, you know, there are good business reasons why employees don't want everybody taking their leave in one fell swoop at the end of all this.
OK, someone who didn't give us their name wants to know, can I tend my allotment? It's a 3-minute walk from my home.
Drumroll using asparagus tips for the new champion of allotments, unlikely as it seems, Michael Gove, the cabinet minister. He said the other day that you can still tend an allotment. It's good exercise. You might get some good sprouts out of it. If you do, maybe so Mr. Gove some.
OK, on that issue, Bernie asks, if people are allowed to go to their allotments, you've just said they are, can we go fishing?
I'm afraid this is looking very much like a big fat no. The Canal and Rivers Trust and the Anglers Trust have both said no. Anglers are known for their patience, and I'm afraid they're going to need an awful lot of it.
You can imagine you could social distance when you are fishing. But anyway, Pauline wants to know, can dogs still be groomed?
Well, I think the parlours, by and large, have closed down. They're not permitted shops, but there are still mobile dog groomers that can pick up your dog using social distancing from your home and use all the disinfection methods, and that is allowable. In actual fact, because they've got that service for dogs, your dog may well end up being the best groomed member of the family, because humans don't have that, of course.
Chris, thank you. Chris is staying with me to answer more of your questions, along with Dr. Sarah Jarvis, on our website straight after this programme. Before that, she's not coming in to film Loose Women at the moment. So what is the actor Denise Welch up to? Here's her life in lockdown.
Hi, I'm Denise Welch, and this is my Lockdown with the Stars. Well, it sounds really corny, but my dream self-isolation mate is my husband. We both like to do the same thing, which is very little. I would love to go and see my mum-in-law, to go and see my dad. You know, I want to give them a big hug. I'm never again going to take a clean skirting board for granted. I'm going to look at it in awe and wonder. Usually I've got some kind of vest top, an elasticated pair of trousers, and the thought of going back to wearing something tight and a bra, can't bear it. I think the guilt-freeness of doing very little is something that I've thoroughly enjoyed, because we live a life where we feel guilty if we lie down, we feel guilty if we go for a massage, we feel guilty if we do a bit of self-care. So it doesn't matter how you're getting through this, just get through it and try to find a little bit of time to yourself every day, and don't feel guilty at all. People are telling porkies if they say that they're not taking advantage of not showering every single day. I usually do, because it makes me feel better, but I think yesterday I was the great unwashed.
Thanks once again for all your questions. So many issues still to deal with, of course. We'll be back with more answers next Monday. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye. I'm studio. Dr. Sarah, if I can start with you, let's go back to the issue we touched on briefly in the programme about hospitals. A question has come in. Why aren't there hot and cold hospitals, i.e. ones which have coronavirus patients and others which don't? Would this would surely stop the spread of the disease?
Well, you'd think it would, but the problem we've got is that you need intensive care teams, and unfortunately we don't have enough dedicated hospitals with the right intensive care units, so the ITU staff can't all be moved across. However, hospitals like the Nightingale Hospital, they're now looking at a so-called step-down model, so that when patients have got through ITU, they may be able to be moved to hospitals like the Nightingale, either the one in London or the one in Manchester, and some of the other hospitals being built up. We certainly, once this lockdown is over, are going to be looking to increase the amount of routine surgery we do. And the good news is that there are far fewer patients in ITUs, so hopefully we'll stop having to use operating theatre recovery rooms as ITU beds, and it may be much easier to separate patients.
Okay, I want to go back to something again that we touched on. This was a question about airports. I asked Nicola Sturgeon. I'd like to ask both of you. Chris, if I can start with you. Questions, but lots of people are asking us about this. Why are there still thousands of people flying into our airports without any controls or checks?
I've been thinking that too, especially when you see some of the controls that are going on in overseas airports. But remember, those airports in the UK are still remaining open for very good reasons. First of all, there is some essential travel that's going on. And also there are Brits who found themselves abroad when all of this started. They're now gradually being repatriated. We need the airports open for them. And actually, if you do look at a UK airport now, it's very different from the way you might imagine. The shops, the restaurants are either closed or they're just doing takeaway services. There's lots more cleaning going on. There's a lot of arrangement of social distancing with all the markings, etc., etc. On this specific point that keeps being raised, why are we not doing more screening? Whenever we speak to the airport authorities, they say because at the moment that is not the public health recommendation. If that were to change, they would change their policy. But at the moment, they do not believe that it's required.
Dr. Jarvis, what's your take on this one?
The trouble is that screening isn't terribly reliable. The most usual way of doing screening is to check a temperature. A lot of people who have coronavirus may have a temperature, but they may only have it very temporarily, and then it may settle. And people may, of course, have a cough for another reason. If we were going to do something and be really reliable, we'd probably have to go down the route of some countries and introduce quarantining for everybody who comes in.
Okay, a hypothetical question from Louise in Glasgow now. Let's have a listen to this.
If one of my children take unwell, am I allowed to accompany them to the hospital? Thank you.
Is she?
So it slightly depends how old the child is. If it's a child who is 26, then I'm afraid the answer is not. Virtually every hospital has said no to visitors, apart from, for instance, women in labour who are allowed to take a partner for labour and delivery, and parents. So if you have a young child, then yes, it would be reasonable for you to take a child in. Different hospitals have slightly different policies, and it would almost certainly be only one parent, probably not swapping between parents. And really, it will depend on the individual hospital policy. But yes, as a rule, one parent is okay.
Okay, we have a question here from Alexandra. I think we've got this for you. Let's have a listen to this. It's no, we haven't got that one, but I can certainly say what Alexandra has said. She contacted us to say, I have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which, as you know, is a form of blood cancer. Both the government and my consultant state this puts me in need of. However, I haven't received a letter from the NHS stating this, so I can't prove this to supermarkets. There are still lots of people saying they haven't received this shielding letter yet. So she asked, I qualify as being treated as priority for deliveries. I'm home alone with my 7-year-old son and no one who can shop for me, so I've had to do my own food shopping. Is it okay for her to do this? If not, what can she do, Sarah?
Well, you should certainly qualify as the shielding category, being in that shielded category, because you have a blood or bone marrow cancer, that's leukemia, lymphoma, myeloma, and so on, at any stage of treatment. Other cancers, it's just if you're having, say, chemotherapy, immunotherapy, etc. But with lymphoma, it should be at any stage of therapy, which includes the active surveillance phase. If you haven't had a letter, you can go online, I think, still to gov.uk/coronavirus extremely vulnerable to register yourself. GPs this week getting the details of all those lists. They should already, they were given about 1 working day to get those lists out and return them. But if you go and register yourself and then get in touch with your GP should be able to ensure that you do get that service.
Okay, for now, Sarah, don't go away. Let's turn to Chris. Linda says, I live in a semi-rural area with several local public footpaths and rights of way. I've noticed some of the paths have been barricaded off and notices put by local homeowners to say footpaths are closed in the interest of shielding elderly residents. Do residents have the right to do this if normal practice of social distancing is adhered by residents and walkers using the footpaths? This is a tricky one, isn't it?
It's a tricky one. And of course, under normal circumstances, you can't just close a public footpath. You know, there are legal rights and what's known as easements across them. There has been some new guidance put out to address this, and people like the Ramblers Association have been very concerned about it. What it allows landowners to do is put up polite notices, perhaps suggesting an alternative route, perhaps asking visitors to be very careful in adhering to social distancing. It doesn't say you can close a public right-of-way, but it does just extend the flexibility a little bit so you can put these kind of advisory notices in place.
Okay, Mark says, our local cycling club had a clampdown on the time members can be out each day. A 2-hour maximum limit has been set. However, there are people still cycling or running for ridiculously long times. I've seen many in the 6 to 8 hour range with distances of more than 100 miles and even one that lasted 14 hours. Would it be better for the government to put a clear limit on the length of time we can spend exercising? There has been talk about limits, but there hasn't been a definitive, has there?
I'm still thinking about the 14-hour bike ride, was it?
And what was he doing?
I don't know.
How did he do it?
I'll give you a Chris Choi answer, not a Chris Hoy answer. That sounds more Chris Hoy, actually. But yeah, a lot of people have felt this sense of frustration that it has not been more specific about how long you should be out exercising. And there's been a lot of different interpretations. Recently, government did actually get a little bit more specific than normally, saying that they were thinking in terms of something like an hour-long walk, a half-hour run, or going cycling somewhere between those two. So that's the kind of thing they regard as reasonable. It doesn't sound reasonable to be in the saddle for 14 hours or anything like it. And you've got to think not just about the wording, but the spirit of these guidelines. It's supposed to, for example, make sure that the NHS doesn't come under any extra strain. And if you're out and about, for example, for that length of time and going into different areas, if anything were to go wrong and you needed help, it would be a drain on resources.
Okay, if you put it like that, makes sense. Nikki wants to know, is it okay to visit a cemetery to tend the grave of a loved one if that's more than 5 minutes from where you live?
Yeah, it's a sad one that's been cropping up an awful lot. And on one level, certainly if it's very close to your home, it can be incorporated as part of daily exercise. But in fact, over the weekend, the government went further than that and reassured that they felt that people should be allowed to visit graveyards, and indeed that across England, cemeteries should remain open. However, many councils have already taken the decision to close graveyards. Some of them say because they were being abused, that people were having barbecues there, sunbathing. So you're going to have to look at what the local policies are in your area, because this is not a universal picture.
Such a dreadfully difficult time for so many people for so many reasons. Difficult time for Tracy. She wants to know, would I be breaking the law by not allowing my ex-partner to have my 7-year-old daughter to stay every other weekend? There is a child arrangement order in place, but I am very concerned as we have not been mixing with anyone outside of our home, and my ex-partner lives with someone who is still out and about working as an NHS manager?
Yeah, well, these child arrangement orders are a formal, judicially organised childcare arrangement. They can't normally be varied. However, for the period of this crisis, there has been flexibility built into the system. So if parents agree to vary the terms, that is allowed. So if they all agree that the daughter shouldn't be going to stay with dad because of potential risk of infection, that would be absolutely fine. Where it gets more tricky is if the parents can't agree. So if one then decides to go it alone, they would potentially have to defend that judgment in front of the family court at some stage in the future, and the court would look at whether that is reasonable, particularly bearing in mind any risk of infection. Now, if a child doesn't adhere to normal arrangements, doesn't go, for example, to see dad, then certainly other arrangements such as video conferencing, phone calls should be put in place, so there is still some of that important contact being maintained.
Okay. Sarah, if I can go back to you. We've had lots of questions. We have mentioned this before, but I think it's one of those questions that people are still trying to get their heads around about what we should do when we either get shopping deliveries or we go out shopping and bring the food in. So let's listen to this question from Siva.
What is the advice on cleaning groceries bought from supermarkets, including items from fridge and freezer section?
What should he be doing?
Well, theoretically, the virus can survive for up to 1 day on cardboard and up to 3 days on hard surfaces such as metal or plastic. So if you are getting groceries delivered, the first thing you'd want to think about doing is whether or not you need to use them straight away. So tinned goods, for instance, if you simply put them aside for 3 days, they're going to be absolutely fine. No cleaning needed. If it's fresh fruit and vegetables, for instance, if you're going to be cooking it, that's not a problem, anything above 60 degrees. Otherwise, the risk of the virus living on vegetables, on fruit rather, and salads is fairly small, but it is theoretically there. However, of course, what you can't do is put detergent on them. So if you do need things straight away, the best thing to do is to clean them with simple detergent and water, because that will disrupt the virus very effectively. Otherwise, in an ideal world, put them to one side for 3 days if they're in tins. If you want to put them in the freezer, that's absolutely fine. With fruit and vegetables, if you're going to be peeling them, that's clearly fine. Otherwise, you would want to wash them thoroughly. And theoretically, there is a risk unless they're cooked, but the risk is fairly small.
Okay, so a decontamination zone in your kitchen then. A similar question. Peter wants to know, my question is, will the virus survive on bedding and clothes after a wash cycle of a washing machine?
Certainly not if that washing cycle is 60 degrees or more. If somebody is self-isolating, it's recommended that you don't share crockery, cutlery, bedding or towels. And certainly it's a good habit to get into for all of you to have separate towels. But no, if it's been washed at 60 degrees or more, you should be fine.
What if it's less? If a lot of people are trying to be eco-friendly and doing a 30-degree wash?
Well, then theoretically, it can still survive. But if you want to do a 30-degree wash and then again leave it for at least 3 days, but of course after you put it out, then you would want to wash your hands, as you'd be doing regularly on anyway. But certainly it's not going to be able to survive for longer than 3 days. That's the longest, probably a day or less.
So a decontamination zone for your washing as well. Goodness, the way we're living right now. Laura, on this issue of self-isolating, she wants to know, considering there are multiple symptoms of coronavirus, why are the general public only being advised to self-isolate on the basis of them only suffering from either a high temperature and or a new continuous cough? Going back to that original advice from the government, there has been talk about other symptoms such as loss of taste and smell, but at the moment it's those symptoms only, is it?
It is, because those are the ones which are most specific to coronavirus, and most people who have other symptoms will also have either a cough or a temperature. Loss of sense and smell is remarkably common with all sorts of viral infections. About 4 in 10 people who lose their sense of smell, it's because of a viral infection, and that was before coronavirus. And likewise, of course, if you have a sore throat, it's less likely to be. Tummy bugs very often cause diarrhea. Up to 1 in 10 people get diarrhea symptoms for a day or two before they have the fever, but they do then tend to have the fever. If you're living with somebody who's shielding or somebody who is vulnerable, my temptation would be to say, even if you have any of those other symptoms, the less common ones, you might want to consider shielding yourself. But most people will get that fever or cough in addition to other symptoms. Okay, good to know. Let's leave you with this question from Simon. He says, if we do not have a vaccine, would it be ever truly safe to relax restrictions? Well, theoretically, if we didn't ever get to the stage of having a vaccine, unfortunately, we would have to continue until we had herd immunity in order to get past the stage that we're in now of this potential boom and bust and these peaks and troughs. So we don't want to get to that stage. We really don't. The death toll would be much, much too high, particularly among vulnerable people. But we would have to get to the stage where we would have to try and slow the number of people who are affected and realise that sooner or later, everybody, including the vulnerable people who have a death rate of 10% or more, would catch it. Yeah, we can't leave this on a happy note tonight, I'm afraid. Dr. Sarah Jarvis, thank you very much for that. Chris Choi, thank you. Thank you for watching Coronavirus Q&A Online. We'll be back at 8:30 next Monday. Bye-bye.